Who doesn't love Hawkeye? He's a superhero dressed up like a purple medieval archer who shoots arrows at bulletproof villains. There's just something so charming and admittedly obscene about the very notion of Hawkeye's existence, let alone the fact that he's one of the most famous Avengers. Well, today I wanted to share one of my favorite Hawkeye moments with you, the day that Clint Barton beat Captain America in a fight. This happened way back in 2011's Hawkeye Blind Spot miniseries, which was a 4-issue limited run that told two stories simultaneously: the origins of Hawkeye and what would happen if he suddenly lost his senses. There's a lot to love about this series. It features Clint Barton in full purple getup, running around alleys and gutters, taking on street level villains. The type of cheesy stuff that's completely absent in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Superheroes just walking their beat and taking out thugs. And at one point, Hawkeye takes on an arms deal in the streets. He shoots a few volleys, catching a few villains in his trusty expandable net arrows and his expanding handcuff bolts. And quickly, Hawkeye leapt up to the roof and onto the next set of criminals. Using a special set of glasses that Tony Stark built for him, which allowed Clint to see perfectly, despite his failing sight, Hawkeye launched a suction cup arrow and latched onto a nearby water tower. Then he swang through the city just like Spider-Man. After reading through this again so I could make this video for you guys, I realized that there are so many classic superhero moments that the MCU will never be able to translate onto the silver screen. And I really feel bad for anyone who doesn't get a chance to see them. So please, please check out this comic when you get a chance. Now, the most important thing, in my opinion, that's missing from the films is the idea of the superhero walking his beat. I already mentioned this earlier, but in the world of Marvel Comics, almost every superhero roams around New York City or their respective headquarters looking for trouble. When you think of that type of situation, you might just imagine Spider-Man swinging through Midtown or Daredevil in Hell's Kitchen. But actually, the majority of Marvel superhero stories used to start simply enough, with the heroes randomly encountering criminals while making sure the neighborhood was safe. And admittedly, it would seem pretty goofy in an Avengers flick for this to happen, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss it. But that was just a really quick diversion. I want to get back to this main story. So Hawkeye, after taking out the group of gangsters, turns to leave when suddenly Steve Rogers appears behind him. Rogers was there for one simple reason. He was worried. Clint Barton was the hothead of the group, at least in the comics, and that meant he was pretty prideful. Even when injured, or like now when he was losing his eyesight, he would take on dangerous situations all by himself. Steve Rogers told Hawkeye that he wasn't medically cleared for duty, and he was there to bring Barton back to headquarters. But Hawkeye wouldn't allow it, so he launched an arrow at Captain America, and Rogers was quick enough to avoid the missile, and he threw his shield in turn. At this point, Hawkeye quickly bent his back, parallel to the ground, and the shield passed over his body. He notched a grapple hook arrow to his bow and launched it straight up. With the rope fastened to a crank on his arm, he jetted to the top of a nearby building. For a moment, Hawkeye must have thought he got away, but he was only trying to fool himself. He knew that Cap was too fast and too strong. Within a few seconds, Rogers himself managed to scale the building. The two Avengers sat there at odds on the roof for a moment. Hawkeye again told Rogers just to go away. But Cap, being Cap, insisted that he was only there to help Hawkeye. After all, Clint was losing his senses, and the equipment that Stark gave Barton was only a short-term fix. In fact, Clint hadn't even tested it out or calibrated it properly after receiving it. To demonstrate how vulnerable Clint was due to his deteriorating sense of hearing, and the fact that he didn't set up Tony Stark's goggle/headset system the right way, Cap ricocheted his shield around the exhaust pipes on the roof, and the cacophony of metal rings and clangs overwhelmed Hawkeye, who immediately became disoriented and proved Cap's point for him. Since Barton had no idea what his own limitations were, he would be vulnerable to any number of supervillains if they were to find him in this weakened state. But Hawkeye again refused to go home with Cap. Unable to convince his friend to return home, Captain America took up an explosive arrow and threw it directly at Clint. Clint flew off his feet in the blast, but quickly retrieved his bow and arrows, and Cap couldn't believe it. And in fact, Steve Rogers seemed to grow angrier and angrier by each passing moment. The super soldier gripped his hollow shield and sent it flying at Clint. But Barton had a special expanding foam arrow prepared for a moment like this, in case he ever had to take Cap on in a fight. He caught the shield and then lured Rogers closer. With a final arrow, he pulled back on his bow and he sent it right at Cap's chest. In a flash, it exploded in electrical arcs and Rogers was knocked out. Hawkeye stood above him, confident that not only was he able to fight in his current condition, but that he would win against any enemy, even one as great as Captain America.